Sometimes I'll ask someone a question and they're like, I don't know. I don't know the answer. It's like, you're not supposed to know the answer yet. Right. My question is meant to instigate you to think. It's meant to instigate you to go deeper.
Hello. Good morning, Shira.
Hi, Esty. Good morning. Hi, everybody. Today we are going to talk about a really interesting topic of identity. And identity is a really, really wide topic. So we probably should have segments on this topic.
Yeah, this is something that is discussed by everyone, like philosophical debates about this conversation of what is an identity and psychologists. So there is so much information on this topic. I don't think we'll be able to even start to touch upon it in one podcast.
Yeah. They're definitely it's from different perspectives, like a sociological perspective, from a psychological perspective, from even a religious perspective. Identity can happen in so many ways, right? Mm-hmm. Identity is multi-layered. So we'll see what we get to today. But no matter which viewpoint or standpoint we take from it, I think that we'll really find interesting things.
So I think the big question that I'm constantly asking myself, and I'm sure a lot of people are asking, is who am I? What is my identity?
Yeah, that's a good one. And, I think especially adolescents and young adults ask this question of who am I? Where do I belong in the world? As a child, they're mostly in their parents' houses. Their parents tell them who they are, mm-hmm. or they're not even necessarily asking the question of who am I? They don't have to be an individual. But as you become an adolescent, you start questioning, who do I want to be? What did I see? And what do I want to become?
Right.
And that's, I think, when the beginning of the identity process starts happening.
And this scares a lot of people. It scares people who are going through it themselves. And it scares, I think, parents seeing their child going through it.
Yeah. I think there's a threat of having your own identity because, we have a human instinct of familiarity. We want everyone to be like us because that's comfortable. Mm-hmm. And when someone's coming out with their own identity, that means inherently they're separate. Right. It means they're different. And so we're going to have to adapt to that new difference. So I think there comes with that angst also.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, going back to identity, one of the questions that I think a lot about is an identity given or is it created? Is identity something that based on how you come into the world, you're sort of set? Is it predetermined?
Is this a nature versus nurture kind of question also?
Right. Yeah, I think it comes very hand in hand.
Yeah.
And nature versus nurture, most of the answers to that are it's both.
Right.
And so I think we should go through probably the different segments, the same way we would think of the segments of what somebody's nature is and what their nurture is. Similarly here of what is given to a person and what it is that they can potentially do that they can create their identity.
Right. So much of our identity we're born with. Depends what kind of family you come from. Many people identify with that. And then some people don't.
Right.
And that's part of when they're start exploring and looking at themselves and thinking about who I want to be, what do I want for my life, then that's when they decide if the identity that they were given is something that they want to take on. Right?
Yes.
And that's the part where they create, and then it becomes true to them. It's not anymore, well, this is your nature. They're making the decision of this is something that I was given. This is something that I was born with. But now I'm choosing to continue along the path and creating this as part of my identity, as making this true to myself.
I love that. And, I think that it's such a normal experience that so many people go through is what is given to you is then you have to decide, do I want to keep it or do I not? And I think this goes hands in hand with expectations. Of lots of times people say, I don't want to do what's expected of me.
Right.
I don't want to do what my parents expected my life to look like or my friends expect. And I don't think there's anything wrong with living the expected life. I think you have to just make sure that you are in line with the expected life and choose that that's what you want. Right. So if you want it and it's what everybody else is doing, then that's fine. And, this comes up a lot with rebellion of, if somebody has a hard childhood, they'll say, I need to do the opposite of what my parents did, or I need to do the opposite of my schooling or the opposite of my religion or the opposite of my society. And the opposite is a rebellion because they want to be so different from it. But also, if they can just choose to stay in or choose to stay with, that's also a representation of identity because there was a thought process and there was a choice in it. So it's not that they're just following blindly. And I think that that's permission that people need.
Right.
Of just because you're doing what everybody else is doing, internally, your process doesn't have to be a living by the expectations.
Right. And I think that what happens is that sometimes for some people, either they didn't have the space or they weren't ready yet. So they didn't go through this typical rebellion stage in their teenage years. And suddenly they're older maybe than what's expected. And now they're asking themselves these questions. And that's normal because this is an important stage that you have to go through where you decide, is this the identity that I want? What do I want to be part of my identity? And if you don't go through it by the typical teenage years, it's going to come up eventually.
Yeah.
And some people, they kind of scorn, let's say, older adults for doing that, for going through, like, come on, you have kids, like have your life together already.
Grow up already.
But this is a stage that's going to happen at some point.
Yeah.
So either it happens at teenage years or it's going to happen when you're older. I think that's an important lesson for parents. Like if you're so scared of letting your child explore or, or giving them the space, like don't think you're saving them from it because they're going to do it eventually. And I think it sometimes can have more effects if they do it when they already have a family. Like then it's not just about them anymore. They have other people, which makes it harder for them and brings up a lot of different feelings.
Right. It's sort of, this is a have to. Yeah. It's just a matter of when it's going to have to happen. It's a natural part of development where you need to step away in order to then come back.
Right.
And I think this is the practice of the Amish.
Yes, I was just thinking that. They send their child out at a certain age, probably 18. I don't know the exact details.
Right. Don't quote us on this.
Right, exactly. And then they say, okay, here's your chance, go explore. And I think studies show that most people do end up coming back. I don't know if, that could be for many different reasons. But yes, they send them out because they want to give them that chance too.
I think it's recognizing the importance of somebody having space to step out, reflect, think about what they were given, and then think about their future of what do I want to keep in and what do I not want to keep in. And that's a part of the identity creating.
Right.
That's me saying, I want to live this kind of life. I'm choosing to live this kind of life. And yes, there were certain things that were predetermined and were given to me, whether it was my family, my genes, my socioeconomic status, whether it was the schooling that I went to, how smart I am, how beautiful I am, how tall I am, how the friends that I had, my social skills, right? There's so many pieces that come into play, but then there's also the choice of what I did with those things.
So I heard somebody say about identity that, you can decide something in one day and that can be your identity. And I have a personal experience with that. For me, how I'm really into my workout now. Yes. A few months ago, I didn't work out. And then one day I decided I am going to work out now. And now everybody knows me as the person who works out. And that became part of my identity when yesterday, for example, it wasn't part of my identity. So people can make decisions about things and then practice it and it becomes part of your identity. In a way, it's that easy.
And this is later in your life.
Exactly.
Right? You didn't do this 10 years ago. So identity is also constantly evolving.
Exactly.
We're not stuck in one thing. And people will say, you're the kind of person who.
Right.
And
but what if I don't want to be that kind of person anymore?
Right. And I think it's a balance because there's always going to be the core standard things that we are, the core aspects of ourselves that usually don't change much. But otherwise, we can vary day by day in other parts of our identity. So I love that freedom, but also that consistency.
Right. Because there's parts of ourselves that we want to stay consistent, that we value, that, maybe even born that way. That's our true self.
Right.
And then there are things that are more flexible.
And also, sometimes life sends us certain situations that change our identity. People go through big life circumstances. Yes. Think of an illness or think of a divorce.
Right.
Think of having children, right? Those are situations that would shift a person.
Right.
Or would be turning points where, I've heard people say after that event, they were never the same anymore.
Right.
Or after that event, they just became a completely different person.
Right.
Or I don't recognize you anymore once you got married. Or I don't recognize you ever since you're a mother. What happened? Or I miss the old you, or I love the new you.
Right.
It really varies. And so those are circumstances that depending on who you are, you're going to make choices that will then shift you.
Right. And I guess how much does labels have to, have a effect on people's identity? The label of someone saying you're a wife, you're a mom, you're a daughter. Does that make the identity?
I think that's a great question, because is our identity, is the outside world's perception of who we are tell us who we are and create who we are? And I do think that that's a big piece.
Yeah.
Right? Because if people will say to you like, oh, you are so nice, you've now added that label to yourself, or you are so smart, or you are so, even, when it comes to image, like you look this way, like you take those labels onto yourself and you carry them around with you.
I remember having a friend once, and I remember we were driving in the car and going to the city. It was years ago. And I remember either I was telling her like, come on, you don't have to get so dressed up. It's relaxed. Like, why are you doing this? And she's like, you don't understand the pressure that I have as being known as the beautiful girl. She's like, I now have to upkeep it. So I have to make sure my hair is done, and I have to make sure I'm wearing a full face of makeup to make sure I'm dressed well. And I remember being, wow, that's a lot of pressure.
Yeah, it is, and when people give us things, we sometimes don't even realize the labels that were given to us. And then we have to live up to it because we feel like this is a part of our identity.
Right.
And, just in the flip side of that story, right? So there she's living up to the expectation of being beautiful, and exterior have to be focused on. Sometimes with qualities, it's the same way of, for myself. So I didn't think that I was fun for a long time. And
you're so fun, Shira.
How
did you think that?
Because it wasn't something that I beat myself up for. It was just not a part of my identity, right? I had so many other things that I would pride myself in. And I think we all have these qualities that we say, oh, I'm these 5 traits.
Right.
And like they sit at our core and we're okay with those. And the rest of them, like, it's okay. I'm not those other things. And so, when we talk about self-esteem and self-worth, right, it's important to have those 5 things because we always need something to back on. But at one point, like I was out with a friend and we were talking about this, and she goes, Shira, like you say it so often that that you're not fun, but I find you to be so fun. And I stopped for a minute, and I never thought about that. And I said, right, like, why do I think that I'm not fun? And then I thought, well, maybe it was the environment that I was in. Maybe it was the situations that I placed myself in. But when I'm with certain people, I am. And so the environment allows that to come in, and there's also going to be different definitions of fun, but so much later in life where I said, I am fun.
And how did that look different for you once you accepted that as being part of your identity? Like what changed for you?
I felt more comfortable in it. I think up until then, there was an insecurity in it where I was doing it, but I didn't actually sit in it. And I think like it allowed that side of me to come out more.
Yes.
Like I think about this like with children a lot. Like how come certain children, like they'll become more musical and you'll see that all the siblings are musical, and that's because the parents put them into piano lessons at a young age, or they took guitar, or there was lots of singing in the house. Whereas maybe another family, they have the singing traits, but if nobody's taking them to lessons and no one's singing with them, it's there, but it's not fostered. It's not it's not
my family. It's known we are not musical. Maybe I really have a hidden talent, but I was always known as not musical, so I never wanted to be part of choir, and I would never try an instrument. Or I think I took piano over like 3 lessons. I was like, what's the point? I'm not musical anyhow. So that becomes so much of what we tell ourselves become part of our identity.
What we tell ourselves and what's available to us.
The resources
available to us. Like, did we go to a school that was challenging enough, right? And if not, then maybe we would say like, I don't really like studying, or I don't really think I'm smart. Whereas if you go to a high achieving school, you might think totally different of yourself.
And I think also different schools sometimes focus on different smarts.
Yes.
So certain people can leave school thinking that like, I was maybe not such a smart student. And then they go to college and they have a whole different experience because so many different kind of classes, different styles happen in college. And suddenly they're, on top of their class. So I think that for many people, there's also trying different experiences. And going back to what you said before about the 5 traits, for many people, I think that sometimes they may have not asked themselves this question. And this was, a group session that I used to do a lot about identity. And the first question I would say is, who are you?
Yeah.
And then the next step would be write down 5 traits. And some people don't think about that.
Right.
So I think for people who want to start discovering themselves, like, who am I? What makes me me? What's my identity? I think those 5 core traits that you mentioned is a perfect place to start. What do you value? What do you value about yourself?
Yeah. And I think like to add to that, another good question is, what are you drawn to?
Which kind of people?
what kind of people are you drawn to? What hobbies and which talents are you drawn to? Which type of situations are you drawn to? How do you spend your free time? I think like all of those are also questions that will lead you to a place of understanding your identity.
Yes. I know for myself, I've always dreamed that my identity would be a runner. I'm not, like, at all.
Yeah.
Maybe one day that'll be part of my identity.
Right.
I think it can be if I do the work to make it. Right now it's I'm not.
Yeah.
But in my heart, I dream that my identity is a runner. So I think finding things that we want and then working towards them to make them part of our identity, if that's something that we value.
Yeah. And I think that's a split that sometimes people have. Once you're in the process of finding your identity, you start to realize like what were the things that were ideal and what were the things that actually are. And I think this is the hardest process because you think your whole life you're going to be a certain way.
Right.
And then you look at yourself and you say, maybe I'm not that.
Right.
And you've been trying so hard to become that person.
Right.
And then it's really disappointing to say, well, maybe my body doesn't have that stamina.
Right.
Or maybe my life circumstances doesn't allow me to become that. And I think that process like is a mourning process that takes people some time to just let go a bit of what they thought they would be and really what they're not.
Right.
You
so
know,
like maybe I'll never be a runner. It's what I'm hearing from you.
Well, yes. Well, maybe not, but also maybe you could try again to try to see, and also like to understand like what was that?
What about that is so enticing to me? Why do I want that as part of my identity?
Why does that so?
Because it's not about running, right? It's not about running. Probably, maybe it is, but probably not. So then the exploration would be for someone. What about that identity of runner is so exciting, and how else can you achieve that feeling that identity? Because it's probably not about the running. It might be about accomplishing a task.
Yes,
about being somebody who accomplishes something big, like for example, a marathon. But if that's something that I can't do, what is something else that I can do that would give me that same accomplishment?
Or something related to it, or something that gets at the core of like what it is that you want.
The feeling that I want of running versus actually running. So I think that's a really good point, because I think people could be met with a lot of disappointment of, I really always, if we stick with this example of running, I always really wanted to be a runner, but that's something that I see that's not within my abilities, and then find something that will give you the same feeling.
Lots of times our identities become attached to certain circumstances. So specifically, let's say with marriage, people will say, I can't have an identity until I'm married, or I can't have an identity until I'm in a relationship, or I can't have an identity until I have children, or I can't have an identity until I'm a homeowner, or until I have this amount of money in the bank, or until I'm wealthy, or until I weigh this amount. And that is very, very tricky because it's not in our control.
Right.
And I think people risk not developing their identity if they're waiting for that circumstance to happen to them. Yeah, I agree. You know, because we don't know when you're going to get married. We don't know when you're going to build a family. We don't know like when all of those things. So you can work at it. But the identity is something that is not dependent on something happening. Right. It's something that can be created today. And back to that conversation earlier that we were saying that sometimes like people get it done later. I see this all the time because like my focus and my practice is mostly on emerging adulthood. And part of the stage of emerging adulthood is people building their foundation for their futures, which is ultimately their identities in the moment. And I lots of times will get clients who are in their 30s, 40s, sometimes even 50s. And I know that when they're reaching out, there's something that they've read about my work that they feel like their identity isn't solidified yet. And that's generally the case. Right. And so, we have like an extended time period where people find their identity.
Because it can never be solidified. An identity. Right.
It can never be completely solidified because it has the flexibility of always evolving and growing, but the core pieces stay the same. And so here I'm talking about breaches in the core foundation where they feel really like they don't know themselves. Right. And that is such an uncomfortable feeling of not knowing who I am in the world, or like who I am is always shifting, or every day like I'm re-questioning my purpose. Right. Or I feel like a child and I don't really feel like I grew up yet. Right. Yeah. So, many things influence our identity. Biggest is probably family. Yeah. Society. Culture. Friendships. I think also your exteriors as well, like, you know, your
how people perceive you,
your financial status. I think also, like, this is something I was wondering about this week is you hear these stories where unfortunately people have miscarriages or they have a baby and then there's SIDS case. And then there's a child that's born after. And many times, like, that child is born into a world with an identity already.
Right.
Or a child who is born where a parent passes away during the pregnancy. They're born with a certain identity, right? Because automatically people will perceive them a certain way. Sometimes they're named the same name. And there's an expectation, it's nonverbal, that's placed onto this child.
Right. Like the famous, did you read My Sister's Keeper? That famous book?
Yes.
So that was kind of like, I mean, that was a little bit more the extreme example where they had another child so they can use, you know, the child's blood to help the older sister that was sick. So that was an example where her identity was to help her older sister.
Right.
So that's kind of, you know, really draw what you're saying. It puts it in a more extreme example to see it more clearly.
Right. You're like living in the shadow of somebody else. Like there's almost like a ghost always there that you can't fully be you because there's somebody always in the background.
It's a predetermined identity in a way.
Right. And, you know, sometimes that can be hard to step out of, especially if those around you are seeing you and placing that onto you in that way. But sibling line also plays a big role in who is above you.
Right. Oldest child, middle child, youngest child. People tell, you know, will look at you and be like, I can tell that you're youngest.
Yes. I can tell that you're the oldest. Right. You're more responsible. You're taking charge, like all the stereotypical things that are expected and all the stereotypical things that are the youngest. Right. And those can be really a compliment or it can be very insulting. Right. Different people will take it different ways.
I can tell you're an only child. You seem really selfish. You know?
Right. Exactly. Or, you know, I can tell that you're the oldest. You're so bossy.
Right.
You know, or you're so spoiled as the youngest, or you're ignored as the middle. Right. Those are like the typical
the
expectations of what is going to be. But there is a real aspect of that. And, you know, part of what I love in therapy is when you come in and you start talking about yourself, you realize all the different identities that have been, all the different occurrences that have shaped your identity into where you are now.
Right. Because it's based on a lot of experiences.
Lots and lots of experiences. And that's what makes your journey.
Right. So I think for people who are constantly asking, like, and I see that's one of the questions that we have about people sent in, is how do I get to know myself? And I think it's about, you have to try different experiences because that's what you see, what you like, what you don't like. And seeing what you don't like shapes you also. Being like, yeah, I've tried, you know, scuba diving and I did not like that. You know, I love that. But for example.
Yeah, definitely like the experiences that you do. I think also the more you are thinking about it, like it is partially an active process, right? Where sometimes like it's non-active, where it's just evolving and happening, but it has to be something that's thought out too, of really sitting down with yourself and saying like, who am I? Who do I want to be? Right. Because otherwise your life is created for you. If you don't put the effort in, like you will just automatically be chosen into or be put into something.
Yes, I like that.
And so to really like sit and think, and there's so many exercises that can be done for that, of saying, what do I like? You know, similarly what we were saying beforehand.
Writing a list of who, you know, what are some of your core traits and your core values that you want. You know, that famous exercise, I feel like I've always done it in camp where they give you like 10 value cards, like your health, money, family, and they say line it up and put it in order. And then they say take away 10 and then 5.
And prioritize
them. And ultimately you're left with 5 or you're left with 1. And that just shows what your core value is. Yep. So I tell people you can write a list of all your values. And it doesn't mean that, you know, you can't have all of them. But the point is to let you know what's the closest to your true self. What's the most important to you.
Yeah. And another thing, you know, I think that helps is asking feedback from people. Like even, you know, not distant people, but those that are really close to you and you trust them, of saying like, what do you think I am? Who do you think I am?
Right.
What are the, you know, 3 things that you would list about me? Or what are the 3 things that you love most about me?
Right.
Or what do you think my 3 biggest struggles are? That can be so fascinating, like to see the perception of the other and then to see how does it match with or go against what I know about myself.
Right. And you can kind of see that from the way you feel when someone responds. Like, you know, if someone says like, you seem so the type of person to, you know, love dancing. And you're like, really?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I like that you think that, you know, and that's a good feeling that you're left with. And that's something that might maybe part of your identity. But if you're left with this feeling like, you know, a not good feeling, like that sense that doesn't sit right, then that's further exploration of why didn't I like that?
Right.
Why didn't that feel true to me?
Right. And it's also like, what makes you think that way about me?
Right. How am I coming across that you would say that about me? Right. And do I like that or do I don't?
Right. Or sometimes we can be completely blinded to the nonverbals that we're giving off, but people are picking those up on a daily basis. And so that's why, you know, the hardest thing is to have a friend who gives you blunt feedback, but it's the nicest thing, because then we get to see ourselves. But you have to be in experiences in order to then get that feedback, and to be open to the feedback and not get insulted by it. You know, so many of the times where we learn about ourselves is when we are humble enough to hear what's being said. And sometimes we want to change it because we say that's not in line with the identity that I want to be. That's not in line with my values. That's not the type of person I thought I was. And other times we say, great, like this really matches up. But I think the best feeling, at least for myself, is when someone looks at me and says like, you are this way. And I say, yes, I know I am
when
that
way.
When
that fits, that like sense of like connection, that click. Then you know that there is a part of you that is being seen that you value. And that is so amazing.
I had like someone I didn't know called up for referral. And they said, you know, we heard about you that you're just direct and straight and to the point. And I said, right. That's exactly what I'm known for. And it was such a good feeling of saying like, yes, my message is out.
I am seen for who I want to be.
And yes, I am seen for who I want to be, and I am seen for who I am. And being known is such a great feeling.
So that's a really good point of what you were saying of like asking for that feedback if let's say it's not just coming to you, because you want to make sure that the way you want to be internally is being seen by the outside world as well. And that, you know, how you're being seen is aligning. And if it's not, if there's that, you know, that miss, then there's some questions that need to be asked of why is it that way?
And I think like, you know, when finding your identity, you should expect there to be conflict in your identity.
Well, yes, only through conflict can we, you know, grow and make something.
And so there's always going to be the parts in ourselves that don't make any sense. Like how can you be one thing and the other at the same time? Like
but sometimes you can be.
Yes.
That's the point. Sometimes there can be two different parts that are conflicting and they can stay that way and they can coexist.
And, you know, sometimes though people will come to me and say like, it doesn't make any sense. Like, how can I handle these two parts of myself? I have so much anger, but then at certain times I can be so calm and nice. And it's not what's the word? Like a contradiction.
Yes.
It's not a contradiction. Like you can have parts to yourself that don't make sense. And also as you're trying to explore your identity, you're going to be doing so many conflictual things. One day you're going to be acting a certain way because you're testing it. And the next day you're might be acting another way. And you see this in teenagers sometimes where they can shift friend groups so frequently. And
I remember my own experience in high school.
Yeah. I mean, it's wouldn't want to ever go back there. You know, all those like teenage insecurities. And
I remember my father telling me in high school, like, this is the best time of your life. And I was like so scared. And I'm like, thank God it wasn't. Because that's really scary.
I think teenage years are just hard.
Because there's all these conflicting feelings. It's one of the reasons. One of the many reasons.
One of the many reasons, plus all the hormones and involved. But you know, there's a lot of insecurity in teenage years. But back to the example where you're going from friend group to friend group is because you're figuring out like, do I fit here? Right. It's like going into the dressing room and trying on a dress and saying, does this look nice on me? No, I don't like it. Okay, let me take the next one. Else. And so in each friend group, you try out, do I like the more adventurous people? Do I like the more intellectual people? Do I like, and as I find how comfortable I feel, that's where I get to know me.
And that's something that I'm personally still exploring constantly. I mean, if we go back to core traits, like I have my core friends that stay with me. And this is going off a little bit on the topic of friends, which we should do one week also.
Yes. Oh,
that's a big one.
Yeah.
But tying into identity, I have like my core friends groups that have been my friends for years, but then I'm constantly meeting new people. And it's like, do I like myself when I'm with them? Do I like the identity of being with them? And I think it's
what
interesting.
What do they bring out in you?
Yes, exactly. And what feeling do I feel afterwards when I go home at night? Am I smiling, or is there something inside of me that doesn't feel great? And I find it so interesting, especially where I live, where there's a lot of young people, and I'm in the park, and I find it so interesting who I gravitate to. I'm like, why? Yes. Why am I always gravitating towards that person? Yeah. What about the conversation with that person is engaging to me?
What about my identity is coming out when I'm with them?
Right.
And, when I look at all the variety of different friendships that I have, they are all so different. And I love having that variety because I'm a complex person.
Right.
So I'm going to relate to different people at different levels.
Right.
And so sometimes you'll have one friend group that relates to many parts of you. Sometimes you'll have friend groups that relate to only one part of your identity.
Right.
But it's so valuable to know what it is in your identity that's coming out when you relate to different people, and that you can appreciate those parts of yourselves and those parts of the friend groups.
Yeah. And it's so telling, like when you come home after spending time with one person or a person that you spent time before, and you come home with a not good feeling. And sometimes it's hard to know what brought that not good feeling, but it's still telling that something's not great when you're hanging out with that friend. Something either about yourself or about the connection with them. There's something that's coming out for you that is not aligning with who you want to be or who
mismatched.
You are. Right.
Yeah. And to be so in tune with these cues that your body is giving, because it knows.
Right. Exactly.
It knows. And so those are a couple of ways of how you can find your identity. Is it too late to build an identity if I'm already older, or even if I have a family already? We spoke about that a little bit earlier, but the answer is no, it's never too late.
Right.
Like, you still constantly can build. It is so much harder to build it when you're older.
Right.
And also, as we get older, we get more set in our ways.
Right. I think that's a good point, though. We get so set in our ways, and we don't have to be so set in our ways.
Right.
I mean, again, there are certain things that we should be. Not everything is, something that needs to be changed. But I think there's this point of being flexible and allowing ourselves to adapt to certain situations, certain people, and certain parts of ourselves that may come up for us even when we're older.
Right. And that's, one of the things that I hope is always going to be part of my identity is the flexibility.
Yes.
Is the ability to always be shifting and as things come to change to it.
Right.
But I heard a story, though, of someone who was in their 30s. And they had gotten divorced, and only then did they start exploring. And so they lived a very continued life where they went into marriage right away, and then they had children right away and went into work, and like the real difficulties of life were placed upon them. And then when the marriage didn't work, that was like a turning point of, now I need to go out and say, who am I? Like, I was living this predetermined life. I don't really know where I am. And I think that's a scary place to be.
I think it's very common for anyone that's going through a divorce, has that suddenly, who am I without this other person?
Right. Like, so much of my identity was connected to them.
Right.
And, so much of my social identity, so much of our friendships were together, so much of just how we spent time was all together. The kids were our identity also of being parents. And now I'm an individual in the world. Having an individual identity, though, is so empowering, because no matter where you go, it'll always be with you. We can't decide what's going on around us.
Right.
So many things won't be there, but we always know that we'll have ourselves. That's something that's really empowering. And I think that if everybody can really do that inner work,
of becoming friends with yourself, of liking yourself,
and understanding yourself. And, there might be parts of ourselves that we might not like, but at least we know the demons that we're facing.
Right.
At least we know, listen, this is an area that I have to work in, but I can't always fight it about me.
Right.
I just need to come to accept those parts and try to minimize them and not be around circles that are going to bring that out. Right. Maybe I shouldn't be with those friends that are a little bit more inappropriate, because it doesn't bring out a good part of me when I'm with them. Whereas I should hang out more with those that are bringing out the parts that I love.
Right. Yeah. But first we have to know what parts of ourselves that we like.
Right. It's that first journey of exploration.
Yeah.
And identity, Erickson talks about this a lot, of identity exploration. And when he talks about the different life stages, right, he starts off with children all the way up until elderly adults. And he talks about the different conflicts that people go through in the life stages. And he talks about identity formation as one of those young adult conflicts. And when somebody doesn't go through that conflict, it's almost like they're stagnant and they can't go on to the next stage. The goal is to settle that conflict. And that's when somebody is left with an identity crisis, or they need an extension of this life stage, which, sometimes people will call failure to lounge, where they're just taking too long to grow up.
Right.
But so much so that identity crisis can lead to depression.
Yeah.
And, we think of depression as chemical or relationship based, but also if you don't know yourself, yourself and you don't know your place in the world, you're going to have anxiety and you are going to have depression.
Right.
Because that's unfulfilling.
Right. Because this is such a crucial part of development.
Yes.
It's not like this cute little extra, you know?
Right.
This is essential to our well-being, to know who we are, to know what we want from ourselves.
Do you find that people want to know themselves, or
this is such a scary topic for so many people? So that's why I think that people tend to gloss over it or skip it or not go into this topic as, you know, in depth as needed, because it's scary to face our demons, like you mentioned.
Yeah.
I think, and if you want to know yourself, you need to know that part too.
It's like when you're digging, you're going to find the good and the bad.
Right. So you have to be willing to find the bad if you want to dig for the good. But if you're not willing to find the bad, then you miss out on all the good. You know, we tell clients all the time, clients who are like, it's just easier for me to be numb. I was like, because I don't want to feel all the hard feelings.
Right.
Then you miss out on all the joy also.
Right. But that's also like, you know, a false self adaptation where you're not really you. Like, you've ever been around those people who it just feels like you're with a facade of a person. Like, there's nothing that feels like inside. And it's not because they don't have anything inside. It's just because they've never gone deeper inside.
Right.
And so you're always operating with that external shadow.
Right. Personally, it's hard for me to like be friends with those kind of people because I just feel like I'm hitting a wall when I'm trying to connect, because I like to connect on like a deeper level.
Yeah.
So I always feel like I'm hitting a wall. So you're saying they didn't go there. I feel like sometimes people are hiding it from the world, and they're probably hiding it from themselves first. And I don't know, what are some of the reasons that you think that people are hiding it from? I mean, the one thing that is coming up for me is that I think that people are scared to face, you know, some parts of ourselves that might not be so pretty.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of shame involved. I think that's a big one. I think also because nobody ever asked them questions to help them go deeper.
Right. So they don't know how.
They don't know how.
They don't know what to do.
Right. So
they may want it, but they're like, how do I even begin? And that's so scary. So you know what? Let's continue on with life.
You know, sometimes I'll ask someone a question and they're like, I don't know. I don't know the answer. It's like, you're not supposed to know the answer yet. My question is meant to instigate you to think. It's meant to instigate you to go deeper. But I think there's so much panic and fear of not knowing, rather than saying, I'm so curious about myself. I'm so open to learning more about myself. And that's where the exploration happens, is allowing your mind to go free. And part of, you know, the difficulties of always having time occupied is that you never get that option to think.
Right.
You're always
keeping yourself so busy.
And sometimes busy with other people's lives or busy with other people's stories, that you're never looking inward and you're never developing deeper inward. So that, and the combination of nobody asking, when is it happening?
Right. So it's about, I guess, making space to allow that to happen.
Making a lot of space for that to happen, and knowing that it's going to be a harder process, and knowing that you don't need to have the answers. You just have to start thinking.
Right. And start like trying new things sometimes. Even I think if thinking is too scary, it could even be like a step less intense, which is like try new experiences and then maybe write about or think about, what was that like for me? Did I enjoy that?
Yeah, like journaling about that.
Right.
That can be really useful, of what did I learn about myself today?
Right.
Or what did this encounter teach me about myself? And generally, when we have more negative experiences, that's when we're going to learn more from those challenges and from those difficulties.
There's something called the Adventure Challenge. Have you ever heard of it?
No.
So I've seen it recently on Instagram, and I think they have it in different departments in your life. And I think it came out during COVID, if I'm not mistaken. But it has like different date nights that you can do. And it could be with yourself, with a friend, with a spouse. And it's about like opening up conversation and trying new experiences. So to get you thinking, like, did I enjoy that? Did I not enjoy that? And it's very interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's wonderful. Number one, it's giving you new ideas.
Exactly. Because sometimes it's hard to think about, like, what should I do?
Right.
You know?
But then also, like, it's bringing it back to yourself.
Right. But I saw that from some of the examples, it was very based around like sensories, because it wasn't just like, you know, go to the mall. It was, you know, do something with music, you know, so that way because our senses allow us to get to know ourselves. So it tie these senses into like different experiences. So if people are trying to think what experiences to do, sometimes doing something that is, you know, with sight or smell or taste, like baking or, you know, cooking or seeing new things, that allows us to have a deeper experience.
Right. Like there's a lot more input. And, you know, there's a difference between watching and experiencing.
Right.
And so many activities that we do is just watching.
Like, let's go to a comedy show.
Yes.
Let's go watch a game.
Let's go to a movie.
Right.
You know, so maybe instead of going to a football game, play football.
Right.
Engage with
that's fun.
the world.
We should play football.
Yes. Now that the weather is getting nicer, we should definitely do more sports.
Right. But doing things
maybe we'll go running together.
Oh, yeah, sure.
So
you're running together.
I'll be your running partner.
This is moving very fast.
Yeah, maybe it's a part of my identity also.
Right.
Who knows? We can, put a goal for the marathon.
But that's a good point of trying things that you're actually doing things. So like, if you're going to be going, we always go out to eat, we go out with friends to a show. But if we try doing things where you're more involved in the experience, then you try new things. We have two really good friends. Shout out to them, but they're very into actually doing things, and they get me to go places. Like I've never done this, but they always do this, and I'm like, okay, that's on my list. They go in Manhattan. There's like a trapeze place, and you literally they tie you, so it's like safe and like, what's that like to be in the air, to be flying? Right. What's that experience like?
Right. In the past week, like I started going camping, and I always used I wouldn't like being dirty right. or, it's too outdoorsy for me. And I went and I had the best time.
It's so nice.
And, I learned so much about myself and also observing others.
Right.
Right. So you learn who is the planner of the trip, right? Who's really good at planning, like who's really creative, who's really the exciting one.
Right. And this is going to teach you about yourself. Like, do you like planning? Do you like being told where to go and when to go?
Right. And it's fascinating to see you in relation to others. Like as you start engaging in the world, it's like when I'm with this person, I let them take charge.
Right. Because when we talk about,
I take charge.
Right. When we talk about identity, we talked about our own individual identity, but then there's also the point of our identity connected to other people, our identity in relation to the world at large. It's not just about ourselves.
Yes, exactly. Like there's our relationship also to friends, our relationship to the world, our relationship to activities, our relationship to our family.
Right.
How many times, this is so stereotypical, but you'll see where people will sit at their family dinner table acting one way, and then with their friends, they're a whole different person.
Right. Yeah. Everybody says that, like, it was so different once you bought your spouse to join like a work event. That's one example that's coming to my mind now.
And how many times do you go out and you're like, oh, I didn't expect your husband to be that way.
Right, totally.
Or, I would have imagined you were married to somebody else.
Right. I feel like this is something that we've talked about before, where we're not necessarily showing our whole identity to everybody at all times.
Yes.
So we may come across one way at work, so that way when somebody meets your husband, they're like, oh, wait, I thought you would have been married to a professional. Meanwhile, your family's like, wait, you don't know her. Like, we know her. Right. Like, yeah, that's cute that you think that,
right. Exactly.
Because we have so much of our identity that is not shown to everyone at all times because that's impossible.
Yeah. And how many times have people like sat in my office saying, well, they don't really know me fully.
Right.
And my response back to that sometimes is it's not healthy for somebody to know you in the completeness always. Like, number one, it might not be fully possible.
Right.
Because you can only allow somebody to know you as much as you know yourself.
Right.
But also is that it's sometimes dangerous to be completely exposed.
Right.
And when it comes to friendship especially, we sometimes don't want them to know every single layered aspect of ourselves. We can have relationships where they just know certain aspects, and that's fine.
Right. I think people struggle the most with that with a spouse because they expect the spouse to know every single part of themselves. And I think that it's just not necessarily possible.
It's not possible. It's just not.
One of the biggest reasons is probably because we're, like you said, you don't fully know yourself. And I think we're constantly exploring ourselves. So it's impossible to fully show somebody our full identity. But obviously you want to be seen for who you are. You want to be respected for your identity. But they may not know every single aspect of it. And that's okay.
Right. That is completely okay. And also thinking about it, right? I am me.
Right.
I have so many intricacies for who I am. There's so many ways that I show up, even day to day, right? Different parts of me will show up in different ways. There's absolutely no way for a spouse to match that completely,
right?
Because that means they would have to have every single part that I have. They would have to understand it. They would have to match it at every single second, and they wouldn't be able to be them.
Right. And I think that part of us explaining it to somebody, also parts of ourselves, allows us to know ourselves more.
Yeah.
So I think having the reason to explain to your spouse why something bothers you or why this is part of what's important to you allows us to become more determined or realize, you know what, maybe I'm putting too much emphasis on this value and it's really not that important to me, and that allows me to let go of something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And one of the things I think is important about identity is when you have an identity, you're usually then have a feeling of I'm an individual.
Right.
And part of being an individual means that you can make your own choices.
Right.
And you can make choices that reflect back to what your identity is. So you're constantly refueling the person that you want to be. Otherwise, if you don't know who you are, you're making choices that might make you then feel a little bit off, right?
And you talk about that feeling.
You might feel missed constantly. And so that's the powerfulness of really knowing who you are.
Because then you can make choices. I like that. So, okay, this I feel like is a catchphrase, what you're saying. So by knowing your identity, you can make choices that fuel your identity.
Yes.
So which leads to feelings of self-esteem, of self-confidence.
Self-worth.
It's like the circle in a way. Know your identity, make choices that lead you to feel fulfilled in your identity.
Yes.
I'm going to have to come up with a catchphrase. We'll write it.
But I think, visually, if you're looking at it, it's one leads to the next, which leads to the next, which comes around for circle.
I love that.
And, so the more that you know yourself, the more that you can instill it into yourself, and the more that you can make choices that will bring it back, and the more that you could then explain it to people who will then bring it back to you, because that's what you want to be validated, which then makes you feel better. And round we go.
Yes. And, one of the things that I love doing these podcasts with you, or just talking to you in general, is because I think of like another 100 things that I want to talk about.
Yes.
So so many different topics came from this conversation, which I'm so excited to touch upon in different weeks.
Yeah. And I hope that that's inspiring for everyone else, is that as you deepen yourself and as you're with people who bring out different things inside of you, there's always more, right? And so like in our relationship here, you bring out certain identities in me, right? Which not necessarily with every single friend are they going to bring that out, but I love the part that you bring out of me. And what we create together.
Yes.
Right. And so there's my identity, there's your identity, but then there's the co-creation of the building of the two of us, which I think is such an amazing feeling.
Yeah.
And so I'm happy that we're able to share that with everyone, and we will just continue to speak.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay. See you next week.